The reporting from our guest tonight, along with that of her colleagues about prominent men across industries, helped set off the Me Too movement and led to a reckoning about gender and power dynamics in the workplace. Tonight, we are joined by a relentless and brave truth teller. It's an honor to have Emily Steele on our stage. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, you can do that using the hashtag CJFJTalk. I'd like to thank those who make our events possible. BMO Financial Group, our JTalk series sponsor. Our thanks to our in-kind supporter, Equal Voice, a vital and important organization. And our gratitude to the National Arts Centre for this magnificent space. This is our 5th JTalk in Ottawa. We are delighted to be here and so grateful to the NAC for giving us a home for our annual event. For nearly 30 years, the CJF has been a force for excellence in journalism. Our motto, as journalism goes, so goes democracy, feels even more relevant than ever in these unpredictable and challenging times. And part of our mandate is this speaker series, where we explore the challenges facing the industry and we highlight the power of journalism to hold the world around us accountable and transparent, and to give voice to those who long go unheard. Your moderator for tonight's talk is another tenacious and accomplished journalist. She has worked for Post Media, Sun Media, CTV, and CBC. She is HuffPost Canada Ottawa Bureau's chief and manages the only bilingual bureau on Parliament Hill. She's been listed as one of the 100 most influential people in Canadian politics by the Hill Times. She's a regular at-issue panelist on CBC's The National and a power panel fixture on CBC's Power and Politics. You are in great hands. Please join me in welcoming the tour de force that is Althia Raj.
Thank you for that overwhelmingly generous introduction. Thanks. So it's my great pleasure to invite our actual guest, Emily Steele. Emily, as Natalie mentioned, is part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team from the New York Times, which was recently awarded public service journalism's highest honors. And what we're here really to talk about is the reporting that led to this international Me Too movement and this sort of international reckoning, and women really finding a voice. And a lot of that can be traced back to Emily's reporting, and we're going to talk about that today. We're going to have a chat for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. There is a mic in the back of the room, so if you please would like to join us in just getting up from your seat and asking a question at the microphone. We'll also be taking questions, Natalie mentioned, online. So if you don't want to leave your seat, but you would like to ask a question, you can certainly use the hashtag CJFTalk to send us your question. So Emily, first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
this is a
you.
real treat.
It's a real honor to be here.
I would like to start off by asking you to tell us about the Bill O'Reilly story that really launched everything. The first time that we saw your byline writing about the story was April 2017, many months before the Harvey Weinstein stuff. But this project had started months before that. Tell us about your starting point and how you got into this.
So we started this story in the summer of 2016, which almost feels like a lifetime ago. If you remember, and you go back kind of in time, almost 2 years now, there was this huge controversy, this really big story in July of 2016, right after the 4th of July, when Gretchen Carlson, a former anchor on Fox News, sued Roger Ailes, the former chairman of the network, for sexual harassment. There were some salacious claims in that lawsuit. People thought that she had tapes. And in a very stunning turn of events, the Murdochs, who own Fox News, did not support Roger Ailes. Instead, they decided to investigate him. And within a couple of weeks, he was ousted from this network, it wields extraordinary political influence. It was this money-making profit machine for the company. And it really was this turning point at that company and our culture of thinking about these sexual harassment issues. It was this huge story, and we just continued to report on it because it was pretty clear that this issue was not only at the very top of the company was not only reserved to the suite and the office of Roger Ailes, but it looked like it was much more pervasive. And we were just kind of rushing to try to keep up with the competitors on the story. And then in August of 2016, the executive editor of the New York Times, his name is Dean Baquet, called a meeting, and he was trying to figure out, how can we get ahead with this story? How can we get ahead of this coverage? And he remembered this case from 2004 when he was the editor of the Los Angeles Times. And this story was this really controversial story. It was this young woman named Andrea Macris who had worked as a young producer on Bill O'Reilly's show. She had brought forward these allegations, these sexual harassment allegations against Bill O'Reilly. He sued her for extortion, and then she sued him for sexual harassment. It exploded into this big public scandal. It was covered by all of the tabloids, and then she kind of disappeared. You never heard from her again. And Dean had remembered this story for some reason.
12 years ago.
12 years before, yeah. And he had remembered, we were talking about it recently, and he had remembered like a video, he had remembered seeing her, he had remembered how it had exploded, and he thought, why don't you go back and re-report that story of what happened in October of 2004 with the hindsight and the perspective and the knowledge of what we now know in 2016, and ask questions. What did this say about the network? What did this say about this culture of sexual harassment? What sort of chilling effect did this have? And so I was paired up with this colleague, my colleague Michael Schmidt, who is a DC reporter. He had covered the Pentagon, and we are tasked with looking at that one case from 2004. So we started digging, and we were digging, and we were digging, and we had this spreadsheet that had hundreds of names on it of people we were just kind of cold calling to try to get them to talk to us, to try to get them to tell their story, and to try to figure out what was really happening in 2004. And we found all sorts of wild and really interesting information. We found that a private investigator had been used to dig up information about her, that there was this concerted effort to paint her in the tabloid press as a promiscuous woman who was out to shake him down. And as we continued digging, we found that there had been other women who had made allegations against Bill O'Reilly. And so we went to our editors and we said, here's this story, which is really compelling and really interesting, but we think there's more. Can we have more time? Can we keep exploring this? And they said, go for it. And they really encouraged us to try to follow the money and to follow the documents. And so what we found over the course of several months later was that there had been this record of settlements where there were, in April, we reported that there had been 5 settlements that totaled $13 million with women who had made these sexual harassment allegations against Bill O'Reilly. That led to this huge public spectacle that ultimately led to him being ousted from the network.
I want to pause here because we're going to talk more about those settlements, but you had some experience reporting on Bill O'Reilly before.
I had,
Tell us about that.
So it was in February of 2015. I was a TV reporter, a media reporter at the New York Times, and there had been this big controversy with Brian Williams, who was a big anchor, the top anchor on NBC News. And there were all of these allegations that he had made claims. He had kind of fabricated a story about being on a helicopter that had been shot down. There was this huge scandal, this really big story that led to him being suspended and ultimately demoted into a different position on that network. In the wake of that reporting, Mother Jones had done an investigation into claims that Bill O'Reilly had made about his own record of war reporting. And what Mother Jones had said is that while Bill O'Reilly had claimed to be a war reporter, he had actually reported on protests of the Falklands War from the streets of Buenos Aires. And so
he had never actually gone to the
He hadn't actually gone there. I had the stat in the story, but I think it was like 2,000 miles away. And so I had done a pretty quick story, just kind of like, here's the controversy, here's what they say, put that out in the paper. And then the next day I was following up on that story because had kind of exploded into this really big thing. And so I called Fox News for comment, and Bill O'Reilly calls me, and I have my headset on, and I'm kind of sitting at my desk at my computer. The first thing that he says is that so far he had found my reporting to be fair, but if I did anything that he found untoward, that he would come after me with everything he had, and that I could take that as a threat. So I kind of just typed this up, because he didn't say it was off the record, and so I typed this up, and then I said, okay, can I ask you some questions? And so I wanted to hear his response and hear what he had to say about all this. And then we got off the phone, and I told my editors what had happened, and we put that into that story, and I tweeted it, and it became this really big deal and this really big moment in time, because for so long, reporting on Fox News was like entering a war zone. It was for so long, Fox had really positioned itself as the kind of like the rival or the opposition to the liberal media, and that they were always under attack and always under assault. And there were lots of cases of people who would write stories about Fox News and then just not, that were slightly critical, and then just not be able to report on them again. And kind of it was this war zone of reporting that people really, not literally, but people really didn't appreciate reporting on that. And what a lot of other journalists had told me is that for so long they had heard a lot of these threats from Fox News off the record, and it was one of the first times that it was really put on the record in a really powerful way. And and so that happened.
You talked about the non-disclosure agreements, and I recognize a number of faces in this audience who are journalists or were former journalists. You've mentioned that the non-disclosures actually helped you tell the story. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of twist, because for so long, the way that the world of sexual harassment worked is, number one, women were really afraid to tell these stories because they didn't think that they would be believed, and they thought that if they did, that their careers would be in jeopardy. Number two, it was really rare that people would go to HR, and if they did, not very much happened. If people went to lawyers, what typically happened is they would go to the lawyer, they would tell the lawyer what had happened, the lawyer would contact the company, and before this became a public lawsuit or had anything that was in a public sphere, it was very quickly settled. And this all happened kind of out of the public eye. There were no records, there were no documents that were public that people would know about. And so what we were kind of talking about in the newsroom is how this really created almost like this conspiracy of silence, where predators and serial predators were able to continue their behavior, and these confidentiality agreements really made it so that nobody knew that this person had committed these acts, and that there was this record or these allegations against them. But when we started reporting, we started to see that there had been this record of settlements, and while they were extraordinarily hard to figure out and to get the details and to be able to report in a fair and accurate way that we could get into the paper, once we did, it created this very solid foundation that showed this documented timeline of settlements involving O'Reilly that dated back to the early 2000s and continued all the way until January of 2017. And what was really interesting about these stories is that for so long, stories about sexual harassment really had kind of like a tinge of gossip or a tinge of salacious drama around them. And what we were able to do with this reporting was follow the facts and follow the money and really present readers with this record of documents and evidence that made it so that the women who came afterward would be believed when they told their stories.
But it wasn't also that you were just going after Bill O'Reilly, it's that you were going after the culture at Fox that enabled him to continue doing what he was doing.
Exactly. And that's what was one of the really powerful parts of the story, is that it wasn't just a story about one bad actor and the salacious things that they did, but it was really looking at this culture of this company and how they valued this man who was bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and who was really the anchor of this entire network. But at the same time, that the company had said that they were committed to creating a workplace based on trust and respect, they struck deals of their own to cover up allegations against him, and kind of looked the other way when they knew what his history was and what his record was.
And they were renegotiating his contract while you were writing about more settlements.
Right. So what was really interesting is we started the story with Gretchen Carlson started in July of 2016. In the months that followed, while Fox and Bill O'Reilly knew that we were reporting on this story, and while the Murdochs had said that they were committed to creating this workplace based on trust and respect, there were 2 settlements that were struck with women who had made allegations against O'Reilly that the company paid, that 21st Century Fox paid. There was another one that O'Reilly had struck on his own that the company found out about. And there was another settlement struck for $32 million that Bill O'Reilly reached on his own.
To one person.
With one person, yes, that the company knew about the allegations and they knew there was a settlement. They say they don't know how much money that was for. That happened from the fall until January of 2017. And then in the weeks that followed, Bill O'Reilly got a new contract for $25 million a year.
I want to talk about how you finally convinced one person, because your initial story was rock solid on the non-disclosure agreements, but you had one person only who had agreed to come forward and attach her name to the story. How difficult was it for you to convince that person to go on the record?
So you have to kind of travel back in time. So we were doing a lot of this reporting in the fall of 2016, which was a full year before this Me Too movement really started to kick up and just create this reckoning online and in the world. And it was really hard to get people to talk. As we kind of were looking through our reporting and started to dig, we started to find that there had been this record of settlements, that there were another number of women who were silenced. But we also knew that there were other women who had allegations against Bill O'Reilly. And as Mike and I were doing this reporting, we just thought it would be so powerful to be able to have a picture of a woman, to have her story, her voice in the article that we ultimately published. And so what we did is we started to figure out, like, was there a pattern to this behavior? Was there a pattern to this story? And we saw that most of the women, or all of the women who made these allegations against O'Reilly, either worked with him or appeared on his show, that he then would offer them career advice, and then he would start to target them with these unwanted sexual advances. And if they said anything, they feared that their careers would be in jeopardy. And if they did say anything, then they didn't appear on his show anymore. And so we started to look at this pattern and we thought, how can we figure out who else to talk to? And so we pulled up the IMDb, the International Movie Database, which is this list of, it was probably like this thick when we printed it out, and Mike and I were in this small little conference room in the offices at the New York Times. With, like, I have a picture on my phone, but it's like there was a whiteboard with all of our crazy reporting on it. It was very Homeland-esque. And we just kind of went through together and found people's phone numbers and called them one by one and just asked both the men and the women, and we asked, what were your experiences? Did you see anything? Did you witness anything? Did you observe anything? Did you have anything happen to you? Was it just a completely fine environment? Was this an abnormality? Like, what was going on in this world? And as we were going through, I'd left a message for this woman, Wendy Walsh. And she was this former journalist who had then gone on to get a degree in psychology and became what she kind of calls herself America's relationship expert. And so she had appeared pretty regularly on Bill O'Reilly's show and then was just suddenly gone. So I called her to see what had happened. And she called me back, and she was walking out of this class that she teaches, and she thought that I was calling her as an expert in psychology so that I would so that I could better understand what is kind of the psychology of why somebody would harass a person, and what is kind of the behavioral psychology behind sexual harassment. And then I said, no, what I'm really interested in is what your experiences were on O'Reilly's show and with Mr. O'Reilly. And she said, well, this is off the record. And I said, okay, what happened? And she said that she had been on O'Reilly's show for a number of weeks. She received an email from his secretary. The secretary asked if she wanted to get dinner with Mr. O'Reilly when he was going to be traveling in Los Angeles, and that's where she lived. So she said, yeah, this is a great opportunity. I'll do that. So she said she picked out this like pretty conservative dress. She meets him for dinner at this restaurant. During the dinner, he promises her a job on Fox News, and he says that he is friends with Roger Ailes, who's the head of the network, and that this is something that he can deliver. After the dinner, he invites her up to his hotel suite, and then she declines his invitation. And then in the weeks that follow, she does not appear on his show anymore, and then she's kind of blacklisted from the network. So she's like, yeah, that one thing happened to me. I thought it was kind of weird at the time, but I don't want to deal with going on the record. There is nothing good that can come with talking about this story. And so I said, okay, is it okay if I get it. This is a hard, like most people talk to me and they don't always want this stuff to come out, but can I call you back in case I need to figure out more details or if there's anything else that I might try to get? She said, sure. So I call her again and again and again and again and again. And then I call her more. And then finally, Mike, my colleague, is like, you just have to go see her. And so I call her and I say, I'm going to be in Los Angeles. Will you see me? And she says, oh, I'm
going to be in Los Angeles.
Yes, I'm going to be in Los Angeles. It's not a lie. And so she says, she's really busy. She has this class that she teaches. She's also appears in advertising commercials, so she has to go do a shoot, and then she takes this Pilates class. I think it was every Tuesday morning. I said, oh, I love Pilates. Which class, which studio? Do you mind if I come? And so then I show up at her studio, and I take this class, and it was one of those ones with like I don't know if you guys have done this, but it's with these reformer machines, and it was so difficult, and I'm like shaking on the machine. And then afterwards, we go and get coffee, and I tell her a little bit more about our reporting, and I say, at that moment in time, we thought that there had been maybe 6 women who had been silenced, who had these allegations, who couldn't tell their stories. And I said, you have your voice. Will you tell us what happened? Can we talk about this on the record? And she had really thought about it, and she said that she would come forward and that she would tell her story on the record. And she said that she was doing it not because she was vindictive, not because she wanted to get anybody or take anybody down, but because she really wanted to teach men how they should treat women in the workplace and that women should be treated with respect. She wanted to teach women that they should be brave and that they should stand up and that they should tell these stories. And she wanted to create a better world for her daughter's generation. And I was just so struck that she decided to go on the record to tell this story. I probably cried, and then I ran back to the hotel and I told Mike, and we were just so excited. And it was just really extraordinary because when the story ultimately published in April, she was the only person who was out there on the record. And when Time Magazine did their big People of the Year story at the end of last year, she was named as one of the silence breakers. And it's just really amazing when you think about this reporting and you think about the bravery of the sources, not only Wendy Walsh, who came out and talked to us, but also all of the people that we talked to who knew about these settlements and about these agreements. There were severe penalties for anybody involved with those agreements who talked. And so people really took a risk and really kind of went out to talk to us about this issue, and we're really brave to be able to put this into the public sphere in a way that has really, if you think about it, it's really changed the world. Because what happened at the Times is the story came out in April, and it really kind of exploded. There were protests outside of Fox News. There was an advertising boycott. There was an airplane that flew across New York City with this banner that said, "Drop O'Reilly, the sexual predator." Women went online to tell their own stories of harassment using this hashtag, "Drop O'Reilly." And so at the Times, editors realized, this is a big issue. This is bigger than just Fox News. And they decided to really marshal the resources to corral reporters to start digging and to start looking into this story. And so that's when my colleagues Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey started to look into Harvey Weinstein. People looked into Silicon Valley, into an auto plant at Ford in Chicago. And it's really just kind of, it's a whole world different now. It's really, really amazing.
Are there women's stories that you heard who just in the end would not take that step, like Wendy? Like, are there similar cases that you just could not report?
So there was this one woman who I had been talking to about the same amount of time as Wendy, who still worked at Fox News. And she had a story that was pretty salacious, and she was okay if we used the story, but not if we used her name. And what we decided before we published our initial investigation is that we really wanted the story to be as rock solid as possible. So it was only the documented settlements and only information that was on the record that we included in that piece. And so we did not include her story in that initial investigation, but as the days went on, she really she kind of found the courage and decided that she would tell her story, and she went on the record with her story. But it was days after the investigation. It was actually the day that O'Reilly was fired from the network.
She felt free.
Yeah, she felt free.
Do you think it's easier now to get people to talk?
It's a really good question. I think it's still really hard and really challenging, but I do think that with every woman coming forward and telling their story, that's really kind of emboldened more women to come forward and to talk about this issue. So after I did this investigation into O'Reilly and Fox News, I started to look into another company called Vice Media, which actually got its start in Canada.
Yes, used to be a magazine in Montreal.
Yes, and so with that story, it was really interesting because I started it kind of in the weeks after O'Reilly was fired from Fox News, and it was still really hard to get people to talk. And it was a generation of women, mostly in their 20s and very early 30s, who were really worried about what coming forward with these stories would do to their careers and whether it would kind of prevent them from getting another job or being hired in the future. But the story published in December, and so during the course of 2017, it's all blurring together now. But so while I was reporting that story, the Harvey Weinstein story came out, and the Me Too movement really took off. And I was able to convince, I think, 5 women to go on the record with their stories in that investigation that published in December, which I think really says something, and it really created a world of difference. And I think what really persuaded a number of those women to come forward with their stories was that it wasn't a story about them and their allegation and their claims against one man, but it was really a story about this culture and this system that had allowed this problem to perpetuate. And they felt like if they didn't stand up, if they didn't talk about this, that they were also enabling this bad behavior. They were letting it fester.
The difference between the Vice stories or the Vice story and the Bill O'Reilly stories, to me, seemed that the Bill O'Reilly stories were all about one man and the culture about that one man. And the Vice stories were almost more troubling because they were about younger men and they were about more men, and they weren't just about one certain bad apple, but a room full of bad apples.
Right, and that's it was so striking to me with that reporting. I don't know why. I thought, after I did the O'Reilly story, I thought, this is going to be easier because, number one, it's so hard to report on Fox News because of kind of like what I was talking about before. Like, they view the New York Times as their, as being out to take them down. A lot of sources there didn't trust me. And it took a lot of convincing for people to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And I thought at Vice for some reason, I thought it would be easier. I thought because women were younger that they would be more free to talk about these stories. But kind of once I dove into that, story, I found that it was really hard, in part because when women started at that company, they had to sign, women and men, they had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so they felt like they couldn't talk, and they worried that if they did talk that they would be sued, and they are making $30,000, $40,000, maybe $50,000 a year, so they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. In addition, they had signed this agreement called a non-traditional workplace agreement that said that they would be exposed to things like pornography and explicit material in the office, but they took that to mean that they were kind of signing away their rights to being harassed. And so they kind of thought, we signed up for this. And they also had kind of been ingrained to think that this was okay. So I had talked to a number of women who had stories about the former head of HR at Vice. And it was just such a really kind of a chilling story, because this woman previously had worked for the Weinsteins at Miramax. And women in their early 20s would go to her with complaints, kind of hoping that she would be their savior and kind of put an end to this behavior. And she would turn to them and say, you're a really beautiful woman. This is just what you're going to have to put up with in your career. And so they at this very young age were kind of conditioned to think this is just how it is, and this is just how the media is and how the work world is. And so it was just it was a really kind of troubling story. And it was different to report. It was almost harder to report on this culture and this system because there were so many stories, and there was this period where it was just like my phone was ringing off the hook, and I was like the HR hotline for Vice News or Vice Media, because everybody was calling me with these complaints. But it was like figuring out how to take all of these allegations and all of these complaints and kind of shape it into a story about this company and this culture, and how it wasn't just a generation of men who were old dinosaurs who had grown up in the 60s and the 70s, but it was guys who came of age in 2000s who also were perpetuating this behavior. And sorry, I'm kind of going on, but what I think it also really showed was how sexual harassment, because it has sex in the word, a lot of people think that it's about sex, but more and more I think we're really learning that it has a lot to do with power.
Yeah. The response from Vice was very different than the response from Fox. Did that surprise you?
It was interesting, right? Because it kind of gets to what you were saying before, that this was a story more about a company and a culture as it was a story about one man. And so what we saw was kind of in the midst of my reporting, people knew I was doing this story because I had talked to so many people. There were some people who were let go. The former HR head left the company. And then the founders of the company kind of just apologized, and they said that they knew that they had created this culture that was this boys' club, and that it was a really bad place where women and people were not treated with respect, and they said that they were sorry and that they were going to really try to change. And then in the months after that story, we've seen a number of changes at the top of the network, where there's some men who there are allegations against who left the company. And we've also seen a change of command at the top, where Shane Smith, the former CEO of Vice, has kind of stepped aside, and there's now a woman in that job.
Do you feel like the culture at Fox has changed?
I think with a lot of this, I think so much has happened so quickly that it's been a dizzying year. It's only been a year since Bill O'Reilly was ousted. And I think what we're learning is that it takes a lot for culture to change, but it's all starting to change. And I think the first step is talking about this and talking about it publicly. But I do think that there's a number of issues that people are still really trying to sort through and figure out. And some of those are things like what's going on with HR, and how did these HR systems really work to protect the CEOs rather than the employees? And what's going on with these non-disclosure agreements and the settlements? And is that the best way to deal with these problems? Or does it allow a predator to continue to perpetuate this bad behavior and kind of further victimize these victims. And so I think those are a lot of the issues that we as a society are grappling with, but then also these particular companies are really thinking about and talking about too.
One of the developments from the Bill O'Reilly stories is now some of the women who had non-disclosure agreements are suing the company.
Yes.
How do you think that's going to change things?
It's a story that I'm just like tracking and following so closely and with such intensity. It's so interesting. So what happened was after the stories came out, Bill O'Reilly came forward and he said he denied all of the allegations against him. He said that the reason that he had reached these settlements was to protect his children. He said that he really had been a target and that his fame had made him a target, that people wanted to come after him for his money. And he made a number of other claims. And so he said that this was a political and a financial hit job and a number of other things. And so what a number of the women who reached settlements with him have now done is they have filed a lawsuit against Bill O'Reilly saying that for defamation, saying that the statements that he's made since these stories have come out have painted them as liars and politically motivated extortionists. And what has happened is in the course of this public legal battle, a couple of the settlement documents have now come out, and it was just a couple of weeks ago that we were able to see some of these documents for the first time, and some of the clauses in them were just so extraordinary. With that original woman, Andrea Macris, we found that not only was this private investigator used to dig up information about her, but she was, as the contract said, that she would be required to lie if any of the evidence that she had was made public. So she apparently had made these tapes of these salacious conversations with him. Mm-hmm. And what the contract said is that if those tapes ever became public, she was supposed to say that they were counterfeit. And the other really wild thing is that this contract included a clause that said that her lawyer would switch sides and work for O'Reilly and advise him on issues with sexual harassment. And so I think there's just a lot that we are now seeing and a lot that can come to light. And I think that case is going to really raise a lot of important issues about are these NDAs proper in handling these cases, and how has the legal system maybe worked to further victimize people who have made these allegations of sexual harassment?
Yeah, it's incredible to see the lengths at which the company would go to attack those who were levying accusations against them. Even we saw that with Wendy.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that?
No, I mean, it was amazing. It was also really incredible, too, because with a lot of our reporting, when we were kind of just focused on that one case in 2004, we went back and we read the clips and we watched the videos and we read through all of the tabloid press about this case. And it was just really amazing to see what stories were told about this young woman who apparently had tapes of a man saying these very kind of describing sexual fantasies involving her and all of this, like, talking about all of these very, very, very salacious and really inappropriate things. And the stories very much depicted her as this promiscuous woman who was out to shake him down. Mm-hmm. And I think number one, it was interesting because the media was fed by these reports from private investigators and they really kind of like latched onto that story and just ran with it. Whereas now I think that as a press and as a media, we listen to women's stories in a different way. And I think we are more apprehensive of taking information and using that to further shame people who are making these claims and are saying that they're victims.
So maybe we believe women more, but women still suffer the consequences of going public.
Yeah.
I'd like you to start thinking about questions if you would like to ask some questions. Emily, you are a business reporter. Before the New York Times, you were at the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. You're not new to investigating. You're not new to winning multiple awards. What was different about Bill O'Reilly and the way you went about that investigation that differed from other previous investigations?
I It's interesting. I have done a lot of business reporting in my career, and this was a very emotional story. A lot of, I think kind of what gets lost with the money and the settlements and the salacious claims are kind of the stories of what's happened to a lot of these women's lives. And with the Bill O'Reilly story, it was really extraordinary to see that all of the women who came forward with these claims, who came forward with these allegations against him, who reached these settlements, they were kind of at the top of their field. They were pretty successful women who are working at one of the top news networks in America, and none of them worked in TV news again. And it was really kind of chilling to see what happened to women who came forward with these stories, what happened to women who came forward with these claims. And kind of also at Vice, too. I spent a lot of time, I've talked about this a little bit, but I spent a lot of time at home on my couch having people call me and telling me their stories. And all of the reporting kind of turned into these 2-hour-long phone calls where somebody would cry and kind of talk about these stories. And a lot of people had never really talked about these stories before because it wasn't something that our culture really discussed. And if you go and look at the research, most women never even told their friends or told their family about these stories or these things that happened to them because they didn't think that they would be believed, and they thought that they were their only one. They were the only one that this would happen to. So I think what's been really powerful about all of this, and this is something that my colleague Jodi Cantor has said a lot, is that we kind of took this private pain that a lot of women and a lot of people thought that they were experiencing alone into this kind of collective suffering that's kind of emboldened this really powerful movement of really listening to women and listening to women's stories.
Did you find that within Fox that, the more you talked to women, the more you could tell them that there were other women like them?
Well, yeah, definitely. And that was one of the things that happened with the Vice story, actually. And there was, in the course of that reporting, I found that there had been this series of settlements, but I really wanted people to talk on the record because it was a kind of a different company and a different culture, and I just felt like the stories that people had that they were sharing off the record were almost as compelling or even more compelling than what the settlements were. And what I found was none of those women thought that they were alone, but none of them wanted to be the only one to go on the record with that story. And so by saying, would you tell me this story if you're part of a group, if you're part of this other, maybe 5 other women who will tell their stories? And that was something that convinced them because they didn't want to be the only one. They didn't want to have all of the focus on them. They wanted it to be about this bigger, broader issue.
In Canada, a few years back, we had a sort of a similar moment happen with Jian Ghomeshi, who was a radio host, and there was some woman who alleged that he had sexually assaulted them. And it took, I think, someone to go on the record to want to be named before other people could come forward. And then when you look at the people who did come forward with similar stories about him, they were all well established in their career. They were not, he had nothing on them and they didn't need anything from him. And that's something that we start seeing, I think, when we talk about also sexual harassment down over there on Parliament Hill. Women who don't have much to lose feel like they have a stronger voice. But the consequences seem to be, I think the stigma, no matter where you are, still exists. And that we haven't been able to shake down.
Oh, definitely. And I think one of the things that was really powerful that happened in the course of the past year was with the coverage about Harvey Weinstein. It's interesting because for a long time it was like the stories about sexual harassment, they were about these very powerful men that everybody knew, but their victims or the women making allegations against them weren't necessarily as famous. But with the story about Harvey Weinstein, some people knew who Harvey Weinstein was, but a lot of people didn't really know who he was. But everybody knew who Angelina Jolie were, Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow. And those women came forward to say, this happened to me. They said, me too. And it was like, the celebrity factor, I think, was really important in saying these are strong, powerful women who are very successful, and this happened to them also. It's okay to talk about this. And I don't think that can be underestimated.
And it allowed other stories, like the Ford story with the women in the Chicago plant, who probably not that much attention gets given to sort of working women, but here, other people were going to have a chance to tell their stories too.
Right, and with that story, I think, had kind of started germinating before the Harvey Weinstein story broke, and I think part of what we are really trying to do at the Times was to show how pervasive this problem was, whether it was in media, in Silicon Valley, in Hollywood, at an auto plant in Ford, with restaurant workers, in comedy, in the arts, kind of everywhere, and to really kind of pull back and zoom out and say, this isn't an individual problem. This is a systemic crisis where women have been victimized for so long, and what has gone on with this system that's allowed this to continue.
What are you working on now?
More digging, more investigating.
On this topic?
Similar, yeah. I can't really talk that much about it.
Are there lessons that you learned from your previous work with Vice, with Vox, that have been instrumental in what you're doing now?
Oh, definitely. I think one thing that I learned, in particular with the O'Reilly reporting, was just the importance of getting your hands on these documents, because I think what that really did was to take this story from the realm of gossip into this kind of hard, documented, evidence-based story. And I think one of the things that was that I learned too is that when you use documents to tell the stories, as long as you can confirm that document is accurate, documents don't lie, and so they can create this really solid record of reporting. And I think that that's something, just kind of as a journalist, that was really instrumental to me. The other thing that I learned too is just really the importance of listening, and I think that there's a lot of stories that haven't necessarily been told because just because the way that our culture is, like, people didn't really listen to young women and women's voices for a long time and kind of discounted the stories that they were telling. And I think that it's really important to listen to those stories and to hold the people in positions of power accountable.
You were paired with a male colleague.
Yes.
I assume that some conversations were a lot easier for you to pick up the phone and call certain people. I also found it interesting that when Bill O'Reilly finally decided to speak on the record, he wanted it to be with your male colleague and did not want you to be in the room.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it was, I still don't know why Mike and I were paired up together, but we turned out to be a really good duo. And it's interesting because we called dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people for this story, and we knocked on so many doors, and we kind of did all of the different reporting tricks just to try to convince people to talk to us. And we were...
Oh, wait, what reporting tricks?
Well, just like, I don't know, just like calling people endlessly and knocking on their doors and writing handwritten cards. And one of the things that we would do is, before we would call most every person, I spend a lot of time kind of researching, who is this person? How do they talk? What do they look like? What's their background? What kind of pictures are they posting on Instagram? What do they tweet about? Just to try to get a sense of who they are and try to think about what might convince them to talk to me. And Mike and I spent a lot of time kind of strategizing, whether it was he was in DC and I was in New York, or we were in this conference room together in New York, just to really try to think about, like, how can we get these people to talk? And would it be better if I call, because I kind of sound sweet and I have a higher pitched voice and people think that I am pretty unassuming? Or would it be better for Mike to call, and he can be pretty tough? But he also can be really charming and really nice too. And so we would kind of like just really talk about that strategy. And before every call, and every kind of bit of reporting that we did. I mean, like, he didn't go and do a Pilates class with Wendy Walsh, because, I mean, I'm sure he is great at Pilates, but I just don't think it would have worked in the same way. But then when we did, so in the first round of that investigation, we didn't talk to O'Reilly. We received a statement from him, and we put that into the story. But in the fall, when we had learned about this $32 million settlement, what we did before all of our reporting, was to make sure that it was fair and accurate, and we really wanted to hear all sides of the story. We sent Fox and we sent O'Reilly kind of a list of questions and a bunch of information about what our reporting had shown so far, and we really wanted to hear their side of the story. And so we sent this to Fox, we sent this to O'Reilly's lawyers, and Mike gets a phone call, I think it's like over the weekend, and he says that O'Reilly wants to meet with us, but they just want to meet with him. And right away our response was, no, it needs to be both of us. And what Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, really said too is, this needs to be on the record. You're giving him a chance to respond to this information that you have found. We don't want to talk off the record. This needs to be an on-the-record conversation. So Mike went back to O'Reilly's team and he said, it needs to be both of us and it needs to be on the record. And then they agreed to meet with us. And what was really interesting, before this meeting, I was kind of freaking out. Like, O'Reilly had already threatened me. People had told me that he hated me, that he thought that I was the reason that his career was in ruins. And Mike kind of thought that this would just be like a kind of a nice conversation, and that it would just be kind of like a chance to really put everything on the table and figure out what had happened. But I was just so curious, like, why is he talking to us? Just a couple of weeks earlier, he had just gone on the Today Show, and he had talked with Matt Lauer, which is very interesting given he's now gone. And he had basically said that this had been a political and a financially motivated hit job, and not just kind of repeating everything that he had said before. So we were really curious why he was meeting with us. So we go to this meeting, and it was a very tense 40 minutes where we basically went through this list of questions and asked him to respond to all of the information, all of the allegations that we had found, including these very salacious allegations that he had had a non-consensual sexual relationship with this woman, that he had sent her a lot of pornography, and it was just this very contentious and even combative interview. And it was interesting because most of the time he kind of sat in this chair, kind of sitting back with his hands on his stomach like this. And he didn't look at me kind of the whole time until the end when he yelled at us, and then he was looking at me at that point.
I should say that this interview with Bill O'Reilly is actually part of the Daily podcast. So you can actually hear all of this. And you can hear when he yells at you because you recorded it on your cell phone.
Yes, we did. It's the October 23rd episode, if you want to go back and listen to it.
So you turned off the recorder and you were still taping him.
Yeah, so what had happened was the ground rules for the meeting was that this was all going to be on the record. They knew that we were recording it, but the Daily is really popular. I don't know if you guys listen to it, but it's this very popup podcast.
It's like number one in Canada, too, on iTunes, yeah.
That's great. Keep listening. And so we brought in, it's this recorder that's like, it weighs a lot and it's this big. And so we brought in this recorder and kind of plopped it on the desk. And so it was there and it was very transparent. But we also had recorded both Mike and I had recorded on our phones, because being paranoid, the paranoid journalists that we are, we didn't want to miss anything. We wanted to have as many recordings of this meeting as possible. And so we kind of go through this meeting, and then at the very end of it, our recorders are still going and our phones are still going, but then we go to turn off this big recorder that's on the table and put that in our bag, and that's when he yells at us. But we were able to still capture the audio, and they were able to include it on the podcast.
You would think a TV guy would know that the mics are always on.
You would.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. Yes, would you like to go to the microphone? I think it's for our multimedia, audio-visual purposes.
Thanks very much, Ms. Steele.
Oh, thank you.
I approve your methods, especially the Pilates method. That's pretty cool, actually. I'm a subscriber to the New York Times. From
Thank
the
you.
Travers debates, they have a silent auction, and they auction off an annual subscription. I was wondering if you could perhaps chart the path, maybe some inside baseball, to the allegations against Donald Trump. And if the momentum that you're talking about for O'Reilly and Weinstein is going to pick up steam and take down Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I think it's something that a lot of people are kind of grappling with right now. And a couple of points on that. One of the things I think is really interesting is before the campaign, there were a number of stories and a number of women who kind of came forward with their allegations, using their name on the record about Donald Trump. There was this Access Hollywood tape that came out about Donald Trump and these kind of statements that he had made, and he still won the election. And one of the things that I think was really interesting is during that time, I had started the reporting on O'Reilly before the election, and then it continued after the election. And a lot of my sources who were kind of on the fence about talking to me before thought, this isn't okay. This behavior is not okay. Women deserve to be treated with respect. This is not a referendum on how we should treat women in our country, in our society, in our culture, and we need to talk about this. And it really prompted a lot of people to come forward and to start talking to us, whether it was on the record or whether it was off the record. Another interesting thing that happened too is there was this period of time where we had published our initial investigation into Bill O'Reilly, and it was, I think, 18 days later that he was fired. In the middle of those 18 days, Donald Trump came out in support of Bill O'Reilly. And when he did that, there was kind of like this firestorm of comments on social media really trying to prompt his advertisers to boycott the show, to try to appeal to Fox to not allow this behavior to continue. And I think that's really interesting. And I think some of the stories that have come out more recently are also really interesting. The women, whether it's Stormy Daniels or Karen McDougal, who've reached these settlements, they have not made claims that the behavior was non-consensual, but they do have to do with claims of silencing women who have made these allegations. And I think that there's still a lot of reporting to do here, and I think it's still a really big issue that we're all thinking about and reporting on and grappling with. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could drill down a little bit into the question of the settlement agreements and how you were able to get them. Because it sounds like from what you're saying that a lot of these cases didn't actually get to the point where the lawyer had filed suit. So if they're not in a courthouse somewhere, how is it possible to obtain them? I'd love to know.
I mean, it was really hard. The simple answer to that is it was hard, and it took months and months and months of reporting, and we kept banging our head against the wall trying to figure out how we were going to get these settlement documents. Because what we found is after that initial case, where the 2004 case, that was this huge public lawsuit, nothing else was public. The way that this kind of happened was the woman found a lawyer. The lawyer wrote a letter to Fox News or to Bill O'Reilly and said, we have a tape, we have these very serious claims, we are going to file a lawsuit. Before any lawsuits filed, the two sides meet and they strike this out-of-court settlement that is a completely secret process. There's no public documents. There's nothing that's out there about this. The penalties for talking about this are so significant that the women would have to pay I think in the settlement agreements, it says that the women would need to pay either back all of the money, or they would have to pay more money than what they were actually paid in these agreements. And so it was really hard. And so basically what we had to do is try to talk to as many people as possible who kind of, number one, would be able to help us figure out the outlines of the story of who were these women? Who were women that you saw in the halls with O'Reilly? Did you ever observe these strange kind of interactions or behaviors? And then to try to help us pinpoint like what the different stories were and who were the different women who had just suddenly disappeared and who couldn't talk and who were silenced. But then it was figuring out, like, who were the lawyers? Who were the people at the company who knew about this? Who were the people who weren't necessarily the parties, but were kind of around that whole world who would be able to talk about it? And then we also really tried to get our hands on those documents, too, to try to get our sources to send those to us or to give them to us. And a couple of those actually were delivered anonymously to the New York Times. So it was, I mean, the short answer of it is really hard reporting, and there's a lot that we can't talk about because we don't want to compromise our sources. But it was really important to try to create that record. And there's actually, one of the things that I think is really interesting now is there's actually kind of some debate about what these settlements have done to allow this behavior to continue, and whether there should be some sort of public database where you can see how many settlements there are at a company for these issues, or how many, so that there's still some level of privacy, because maybe the women don't want this out about them, or the men kind of, it's not necessarily a career-ending offense, but how is there some public accountability on this process that's been so kind of shrouded in secrecy for so long? And one of the other things, sorry, I'm kind of going on a little bit, but one of the other things that was really helpful in our reporting is when Mike and I were really kind of getting started on this, it was, I keep saying this, but it's like, it can't be underestimated. It was a year before this Me Too movement. We didn't really have a blueprint to follow for this reporting, and we were really just like trying to figure it out, and we would spend a lot of time going down one route and it wouldn't work, and then we'd come back and then we'd talk to our editors and they'd say try this, and then we'd try that and it wouldn't work, and then we'd come up with our own idea and try something else. And one of the things that was really helpful is we were kind of talking to people about this pattern of behavior, and one of our sources said, you know, it's just like the Catholic Church. It's really similar to how the Catholic Church handled the sex abuse case. And so Mike and I thought, well, why don't we go and read the Boston Globe's coverage of the sex abuse scandal and try to figure out how did they do that reporting, and could we try to recreate that? And we were really desperate. At one point, Mike suggested that we watch Spotlight, so I went home that night and I watched the movie Spotlight, and we saw kind of the diligence of them, like going down into the, I don't know if I'm sure you guys have seen this movie, but like going into the basement and pulling up the records and looking through the names. And so we thought, what's our database? And then we found the international movie database and just started kind of doing the same thing. And then just like listening to how Rachel McAdams, the actress who plays Sasha Pfeiffer, the reporter, talked to her sources and got them to open up and talk about these really sensitive topics was really helpful for me, because like we had talked about before, like I was a business reporter. I was used to asking people about like, what company are you going to buy, and what's going on with revenues, and what's happening with the advertising, like all of those sorts of things. And so it was really helpful to just try to figure out like how to do this sort of reporting. And so, yeah, it was great.
It's not about records, but one thing I think you've mentioned before that Rachel says in the movie is language is so important.
Yeah. There was this one scene in the movie where she is meeting this guy named Joe Crowley, who was one of the first people who went out and talked on the record about being molested by a priest. And they somehow had found him, and they were meeting in a coffee shop, and he says, yeah, I was molested. And she like looks at him very earnestly and says, I'm going to really need to know the details. The details and the words are really going to be important here. And she just kind of says it like quietly and earnestly, and and very sympathetically too. And they kind of go on a walk in a park and they talk, and he tells her all of the details of what happened. And so then I would kind of use that line with sources, and it was really amazing. A couple of weeks ago, I actually got to meet Sasha Pfeiffer, who is now still a journalist at the Boston Globe. And I was just so grateful to her for kind of paving the way with these stories. Because I think so much we think about like this one moment being the moment that burst open the dam and led to this floodgate. But what I've really started to think about and learn is how it's really like this iterative process where it's like one story leads to the next story, leads to the next story. And I think it's the same with journalism, and it's the same with women coming forward with these stories as well.
Just before, Elizabeth, where are you? Did that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, my name is Jenna Kokulo. I just finished my first year's
I can't really hear you very
much.
much.
Can you?
Oh, hi. So I like to do reporting on gender issues as well, and I guess the media has been the best way to facilitate culture change, to hold perpetrators accountable. But I was just wondering if you thought that at some point women coming out to tell their stories will stop having an impact, and what is next for journalists and reporters in terms of continuing this culture change without having to constantly rely on women to do like this emotional labor of telling their stories, and like what's next in terms of that.
That's a really great question. I think kind of two things. One of the things that I think was so powerful about all of these stories is that they were about very powerful men in the media who shaped so much of the narrative of how we think about the world. So Bill O'Reilly was this huge force in conservative media. Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, Harvey Weinstein, these are all men who helped us kind of shape culture and shape our understanding of ourselves. And I think that that's a really, really, really powerful, powerful thing. I also think that it was like almost dizzying and exhausting and traumatic in the fall when the Me Too movement really erupted, and it was like day after day after day was another woman, another story, another terrible, terrible thing that had happened. And I think people kind of start to get a little numb to those stories in a way that you have to really remember these are all important. They're really important. But I think as journalists, what we are really kind of tasked with next is examining the systemic issues that have allowed this to perpetuate. So what's gone on with these HR systems, what's gone on with legal departments, what's gone on with the non-disclosure agreements, why has the law not really made it possible why has the law not protected women in the workplace? What's gone on in our society, that there's a statistic from the other day about how 43% of middle schoolers have been say that they have been sexually harassed. Like, what does this say about power in our culture? And then even stories about the gender pay gap. And there was this really powerful op-ed that was written on Equal Pay Day, which was the day that women have to work into the next year to make up for all of the money that the men made in the previous year, written by Lily Ledbetter, who is one of the prominent women who first sued about the gender pay gap issue. And what she said is that it's more than about money, it's about how we value women in the workplace. And so I think that there's a lot of issues to continue to report on and to explore here.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, it's very illuminating, enlightening to discuss these terrible things that have happened and the systemic problems and ways that it might change. But my question is more at the personal level about the perpetrators, these creeps, the ones that you have met directly or that you have talked to other journalists about or other people doing that kind of work. Have you seen any evidence that any of these serial perpetrators have started to realize, or it has hit home to them what they have done, what they have caused to their victims? And is that any sign of hope on that front, I guess? Hope for the future?
Yeah, I think, it was interesting, like, as these wave of stories were coming out, and it was like powerful man after powerful man after powerful man fell, it almost became kind of like a science of studying the apologies and the response, and they really were all over the charts. So Bill O'Reilly said that he'd never mistreated anybody in his life, that he was the victim, that his fame had made him a target, that the only reason he had settled these claims was because he wanted to protect his children. Harvey Weinstein, I think, had said that he was a dinosaur who grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and that he was working and trying to change his behavior, and that he also would take on the NRA. I think there was an apology from Louis C.K. I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was kind of like an apology without saying I'm sorry. And I think that it was a really interesting thing to kind of look through and try to really figure out, do these people realize what the women have said really hurt them and really affected them? And I think that we're kind of still kind of waiting to see how a lot of this shakes out. I mean, one of the things we were talking about last night was just kind of what happens to somebody after there have been these accusations made against them. Will they be able to resurrect their careers? Mm-hmm. If so, do they need to do a public apology tour? What do they do to be able to repair their reputation? But at the same time, I think we also really need to think about some of the women who came forward with these accusations and the allegations, and a number of them who were silenced never worked in their chosen profession again. And so as much as kind of we think about the men and the stories and their downfall and what happened to them, you also have to think about, like, what about these women whose lives were lost? The story of Andrea Macris was the original woman who filed suit against Bill O'Reilly. It was really chilling. She never worked in TV news again. She kind of floated. Her story was kind of like the epilogue at the very end of that first investigation, and she had a really hard time. She suffered from post-traumatic stress, was in a psychologist's office every couple of days, and I think that there's I just think that there's a lot of both sides of the story that we're thinking about and looking into.
Yeah, how they resurrect their careers as well. Otherwise, the change hasn't happened.
Right, and one of the things that was really interesting that happened this Gretchen Carlson, the former anchor of Fox News, actually announced that she was producing, I believe, a documentary series on A&E networks. And I just think that was really significant for two reasons. One, because she was going back into TV and working in this chosen field and doing what she wanted to do, but also how rare it is that we see women come back after they've done something like this, because they face a really hard time getting hired at other jobs and elsewhere, because people are worried that they're going to make these claims again, not that this was something that had happened to them that they were talking out about.
Joanna?
Hi, thanks for coming to speak with us. You described that really powerful moment with Wendy sort of walking through, after the Pilates class, walking through all the reasons why she agreed she would come forward and that there'd be some good coming out of that. And you talked about how you convinced the women at Vice to talk to you because they were not alone. They realized they were not alone. But I was wondering if you ever felt a responsibility to walk them through the implications of what could happen after their story came out, particularly with those young women at Vice being slightly less savvy perhaps, and how you sort of walk that line between seeking truly informed consent from your sources and yet really wanting, for obvious reasons, to convince them to talk to you.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. This is something that we thought about a lot, and one of the things that was really helpful for us is what had happened kind of in the midst or before a lot of this reporting was, there were a lot of the stories about the women who came forward with allegations against Trump. And a lot of those were, a lot of those women faced a lot of like online hate and trolling and threats and all of that. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody who was coming forward felt really safe and felt comfortable and knew what they were doing. It wasn't like I was talking and then she said we went on the record and then all of a sudden we like went and published the story right away. We were really, really careful too to not just talk to somebody and get their story, but to talk to a friend, to talk to a mom, to talk to a sister, to talk to a coworker who could corroborate what they had said had happened, or would be able to say that this woman had told them that story at the time. We asked to see emails, we asked to see text messages. We really wanted to make sure that whatever we put out, not just for the women, but also for our own reporting, would be able to stand up to a lot of scrutiny. And then the thing that's really interesting is that the women at Vice were younger, but they all really knew what they were doing. And it was really interesting to me. I think two of the women who decided to talk on the record with the story actually kind of put out these statements online about why they decided to break their NDA and why they decided to come forward. And what was very interesting to me is they very much echoed what Wendy Walsh, the Pilates woman, said. And that even though they're 30 years younger than what she is, they said they wanted to make the world a better place for their daughters or the girls who are kind of growing up now. So, yeah.
Did you walk them through what might happen to them?
I didn't walk anybody through what might happen to them, but I was very careful kind of with everybody that we were writing about, whether it was Bill O'Reilly, the people at Vice, or the women, kind of how we were characterizing what they had said happened, so that I'm a big believer that I would rather hear the complaints and hear the questions about what's accurate before a story is published, instead of waiting until after it's published and then having to go back and fix it. And so we are really careful to make sure that nobody would be surprised with what we were reporting. But I actually didn't talk that much about kind of what would happen to these people after the stories came out. Wendy Walsh received a lot of hate messages and threats and things on Twitter. And she took the advice of her daughter, who is a college student, who would just like the messages and send them a happy face and just kind of diffuse the situation. And then the other thing that happened to her too is she also received a lot of support, and people sent her flowers, and she went on TV and she talked about this. And so she was named one of Time Magazine's silence breakers. And so there was a lot of hate, but she's also a woman. I think she's in her 50s, and she's kind of been in the media, and she kind of understood what was going on, what was going to happen.
We're almost done. I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay.
About how do you know when you're being lied to? Because one thing that I've noticed from the lawsuit stories coming out, where there were all these statements from Fox about, well, you didn't call the hotline, but then there actually wasn't a hotline. Were there inklings that you thought the company is leading you down the wrong path, or what's your response to discovering that you guys were not nice?
There's pretty early on in our reporting, Fox and Bill O'Reilly knew that we were reporting on this story. And so Bill O'Reilly's lawyer went and met with our lawyer, David McCraw, at the New York Times, who's fantastic. And he basically said that Mike and I were trying to dig up a story where there was none, and that there was no record of any employee ever at Fox News during Bill O'Reilly's tenure reporting an issue of sexual harassment involving him to the legal department or the HR department. And like presented this letter that stated this, and we kind of took it, we said, okay, interesting, and just like kept reporting and kept trying to figure out what was going on. But yeah, there were definitely instances where people were not honest or truthful with us and tried to keep us from figuring out what the story was.
People lie all the time.
Yeah, they do.
Thank you very much.
Thank
This
you.
was lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've been treated to a superb hour and a half of discussion. On behalf of the CJF and the entire audience, I'd like to thank Emily Steele for being with us and for sharing the stories behind the stories that brought issues of power imbalance into the international spotlight, that challenged the status quo and effected powerful change. And our thanks to Althia Raj for the work she put into making this a timely and relevant conversation. Please join me in another round of applause for our speakers. And our thanks to all of you for being with us and for supporting the work of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. It's my pleasure to invite you to join us for a cocktail reception, meet Emily, and continue this conversation. Thank you.